Hello and welcome to Compounding Curiosity. I'm your host Kalani Scarrett, and this podcast is all about compounding your curiosity alongside my own through thoughtful interviews with interesting guests. For transcripts and detailed show notes, check out the links in the description. Hopefully you're as keen as me to learn something new, so let's get stuck in. My guest today is John Buchanan. John is a former coach of the Australian national cricket team, where he helped lead them to 3 World Cup victories, a world record 16 consecutive test match victories. I could go on and on and on, but for me, I was a cricket tragic growing up, so John was the bee's knees being able to lead one of Australia's greatest ever cricket teams. Personally, I would put John on the same level as a lot of other great coaches of the past and present, such as Greg Popovich, Phil Jackson, Pat Riley, Sir Alex Ferguson, so I really think there is a lot to take away from this episode, and I cannot wait, so let's get stuck in. John, super excited to have you here, as I've been a big fan of your work ever since reading your book, If Better Is Possible, when I was about 15, so about 10 years ago now. And it's not just your success as a coach that I admire, but the way you approach coaching, in that it's about helping the person develop and grow as an individual first, and then as an athlete second, which I think seems to align with a lot of other great coaches that I admire, like Greg Popovich or Phil Jackson. And I know that people will always look at outcomes and wins as the be-all and end-all of success, but today I was hoping to talk a little bit more about the process, about building teams, leadership, and how we can sort of apply these in all areas, not just in sports, but in business or in other leadership positions that you might find yourself in. So I think just to orientate the audience, I think it'd help just to hear a sort of thumbnail sketch of how you sort of ended up with your first coaching gig at the Queensland Bulls.
Like most young boys, presumably still now, but when I was growing up, it was always the dream was to play cricket for Australia, wear the baggy green cap. That was what I was going to do. You know, I kept pursuing that dream through school, through university. I was fortunate enough that I was able to get to university, albeit that I stumbled around there for a little while, but finally managed to get a degree, which was in human movement studies, which was a morphing of the old physical education degree. But I was pursuing my career, reasonably successful at club level, went to play professionally in England for a couple of seasons, and then that took me to the Queensland side. I think in the late 70s, just around when Packer was changing cricket, the face of cricket, the whole face of cricket. So I played a pretty unsuccessful season with Queensland, and then the Packer series finished, and it was time for me then to basically shelve that dream and look for other dreams. That was around then becoming a sports administrator. Chased that for a while. A sports analyst in the 12 Commonwealth Games in Brisbane and national director for Australian volleyball, but eventually found that sports administration really wasn't my cup of tea, and so then looked for the new dream, and the new dream was around wanting to educate, teach people about sport, about physical activity, the benefits of it, and so on. So I moved into TAFE, a diploma of teaching there, and was within TAFE for a bit over 2 years, but found really that because I'd been brought up in a private school and virtually had the silver spoon in my mouth all the time, I just didn't think that I was able to connect with the type of students that were coming through TAFE and what they really needed. So I enjoyed the teaching, so we then, my wife and 2 young children, travelled to University of Alberta in Edmonton, Canada, where I studied a master's degree in sports coaching, sports administration, anything to do with sport, basically. Cut a long story short, ended up coming back to, it became the University of Canberra, but initially it was Canberra CAE, and started teaching in the field of all those things, sports coaching, sports admin, anything to do with sport. And in fact, we had a very good relationship with the Canberra Raiders in those days, so this is now mid-80s, mid to late 80s. And Mel Meninga, Gary Belcher, basically the Raiders team were in various classes in sports marketing or sports history or whatever it might be. So that was all nice, and the family was growing. We had 3 young children at that point in time, and the rules changed though. They decided to, or Canberra colleges of advanced education, which Canberra was one, became universities. And so that virtually meant that a master's degree was not sufficient really to advance too much further in the tertiary education system. So it was time to go and get a doctorate if I wanted to stay, remain and progress. So I tried that for about 3 or 4 months and realised the doctorate wasn't really what I was wanting to do. I'd had enough study and I didn't see the value in and sort of being an expert on something relatively small and seemingly unimportant. So found the possibility of coming back to Queensland, running a program called Aussie Sports, which this is now 1990. Aussie Sports was really a reincarnation of the Daily Phys Ed program. The Daily Phys Ed program had been a reincarnation of the National Fitness program. And of course now Aussie Sports, which is defunct, but it's been morphed into a few other names since that time. But in 1990 it was Aussie Sport, and it was a program funded by the Australian Sports Commission, and in conjunction with each of the state education departments and departments of sport, we rolled out the program into schools and after-school activities, where basically it took a whole range of sports and modified it for young children. Modified the equipment, modified the fields, modified the rules, and instigated codes of behaviour, mainly for parents. And so it was a wonderful program. Continued till the Sports Commission said, well, it's back over to the States to run them, and certainly in Queensland, the state decided that it didn't have the funding to do so. But I remained within the Department of Sport, and again, it was an interesting time, involved in managing other parts of the department, including funding programs, grants programs. But along came in 1994 an advertisement for coach of the Queensland Bulls. I had been, if you like, dabbling in coaching prior to that. Prior to going to Canada, I coached a team in Brisbane, the Brisbane A-grade competition called Colts. And in that particular team, so this is early 80s, mid-80s, was a young bloke by the name of Ian Healy. He was their captain. And there was an inkling of direct sports coaching. And when I came back to Queensland with the Aussie Sport program, I decided to begin to test this notion that maybe I could coach in some way, shape, or form. So I went back to my old cricket club, which was University Cricket Club, and coached there for 2 years, and we won a couple of titles there. But then this job came along, and, it had been 16 years since I had any direct involvement with Queensland cricket. As I said, that wasn't a very successful year as a player. And in the role of coach at the time was Jeff Thompson. He'd been in that role for 4 years, and obviously most people who follow cricket know who Jeff Thompson was, and certainly the number of the other candidates were all highly credentialed former players. I asked Ian Healy at the time, who was captain of Queensland by then, whether or not those who were advertising the job, Queensland cricket, were serious in terms of did they want people to apply for the job, or was it one of those jobs where you applied and it was understood who was actually going to get the job? And his view, no, it was certainly open that I should apply. So what it made me do was then to try to work out why I did what I did. In other words, this thing called coaching, was I really a coach? And if I was, what is it that I did? And so for the next 3-4 weeks or so, I used to go running, where I was sort of away from everything and could just think by myself and not distracted by work or other interruptions, and began to work out by searching back into my history, back into my dreams in the backyard, coaches, teachers, fellow players, colleagues, going to university, and all the players and experiences, good and bad. And eventually I kind of worked out what my philosophy was, what my values and principles were, and importantly, I worked out that I was a coach. And so that's what I was able then to take to the interview table, not my pedigree as a former first-class cricketer, because it just wasn't going to stack up, but indeed what I was actually going to bring to Queensland cricket to convince them, firstly, that I should be given the role, and then secondly, that I would be successful in the role over a period of time. So that's kind of where it all started. I was appointed in, I think, June 94. As history shows now, that in that first season we were able to win the Sheffield Shield, first time that Queensland had won that in 69 years. Not that it had gone close many times, but hadn't been able to make it across the line. And so that was the holy grail of cricket for Queensland at that point in time.
When you took over as Queensland cricket coach, you had a few very experienced and successful cricketers, maybe towards the tail end of their careers, in Alan Border, Craig McDermott, Carl Rackerman. How do you go about making sure that they buy into your message and vision?
Yes, well, I think it's the same no matter where you go. Firstly, you're appointed as coach, so there is some formal acknowledgement of you as a leader, and there is some deferment, if you like, to authority that you have a position of leadership, but at the same stage that accords some sort of respect. But in the end, that only lasts so long, and you've got to be able to demonstrate that you know what you're talking about. You've got to demonstrate that by coaching abilities and the way you talk and communicate with everybody. So there's no guarantee, absolutely no guarantee. And initially I decided that because of that, I would just take 6 months leave of absence from the public service. And if it didn't work out, this didn't go the way that I was hoping, that I'd return to the public service. But it took me probably 3 months to reply to them to say, I'm not coming back, because I really found what I think I meant to do, which was coach. Now, therefore, there's said no guarantee that individuals are going to follow you. In fact, early in that particular season, with Alan Border playing what turned out to be his second last season, although at the time it was going to be his last season, I was bringing in computer technology, which had never been done before in cricket. It was still an experiment for all of us. We were learning as we went. This piece of machinery that could capture data and capture vision could help us with analysis and feedback, but really wasn't pertinent to cricket. And he, in those certain terms, told me for him it wasn't. And that was one of my early learning lessons as a young coach. That every person's an individual, obviously, but every person's different in terms of their experiences, their knowledge, the way they go about preparing themselves, the information they need, and how do they go about learning. So that was an interesting experience. I quickly learned from that, but I was changing the way things were done. Not just computer technology, but just the way that we trained and what was put into training. Obviously, with the computer technology, we're gradually changing the way that team meetings might occur, the information that was in there, how we could use vision, just the way that we reviewed games, but also we changed the dynamics between the old and the young. And so we collapsed the two squads together. There was a QAS squad, and the QAS squad was a group of young boys, and obviously the ball squad was generally older or had been around for a while, but it was important to bring those two together because they could both in their own way challenge each other. You stretch resources and the way that we manage that, but we were able to do that and really set about building a very, very strong family. And family was not just the players, but it was their wives and partners, children and everybody else. And looked at having regular sort of barbecues where we could after games or through training sessions. And, I suppose the other thing that has been part and parcel of what I did with Queensland, what I did with the Australian team, and what I continue to do in my corporate work. And it's very much embedded into my own philosophy, and that is about having a picture of the future. What is it that we really want to be? And it needs to be something, in my mind anyway, that's probably unachievable, yet potentially possible. So with Queensland, the vision then was we were going to dominate domestic cricket for the next 10 years. So to do that, we had to do a lot of things. We had to change the system process. That wasn't going to happen overnight, and so it was step by step. And one of those steps, I can recall an early meeting with, as you mentioned, a few of the senior players, which was the Rackamans and the Borders and the Healy and the Dermots, and the Barsbys, Taslers, the players that have been around for some time, was to go in and say, look, I haven't obviously been around Sheffield Shield cricket for a heck of a long time. You guys know how it rolls. So let's have a look at just simple things like how do we travel? Where do we stay? What do we wear? Because I wanted us to present a different image than I thought had been presented previously. I wanted us to demonstrate a new image of professionalism because at the same point, which was really advantageous was that there was a new marketing officer or marketing gentleman that had come on the year before, and he'd begun this whole concept of the balls. And in my particular year, that first year, we set about creating posters and logos featuring this new look, the new colours, just new messaging. And so all that sort of played into this growing momentum. This Bulls outfit, certainly internally, was something different than it had been before, but externally, suddenly going interstate with computers and using something that nobody else has done, and they're training slightly differently, and they look different from the time they step off a plane to the time they leave. There was a growing sense that there was change afoot within that Queensland team. And so, while change is definitely important, it still has to go along with results. So while I'm very much a process person and always believe in the process, as a coach, as a team, as a business, if results are not coming, then it is time to work out why that's not occurring. And generally it'll be, well, maybe it's the coach. It's time to change it over. And increasingly so these days, I think, if we look around professional sport and even into corporate life, if profits are not there, or at least meeting the expectations of shareholders, and in the sports case, if it's not meeting the expectations of either players but importantly fans, then there is a very, very quick backlash, and media play a significant role these days in terms of fostering that by this constant search for the next headline and the next story. So yes, results become pretty important. As I said, fortunately, we were stacking some results together early on in the season. Wasn't necessarily consistent, but reasonably early on. So from a player's perspective, when you think about them following you, one, what he's doing is different. That's interesting. We're all learning and experimenting. We're doing some different things that other people aren't doing. And at the same stage, we're getting some results. And whether it's winning or losing, we're actually sort of analysing that far better than what we had done previously, or at least far differently than what had been done previously. So a lot of pieces go into having people want to follow you, want to believe in you. And gradually, as that occurs, then the respect I mentioned earlier that comes with a formal position, that remains, but now you're actually earning the respect of players and support staff because they begin to believe in the process that you're doing. And as they begin to believe more and more in what you're doing, it kind of fuels itself. And so it becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy.
It's interesting that you brought up that when judging a coach or a leader, that the media often drives this obsession with focusing on the results and how that defines how good they are. But how would you go about assessing a coach or a leader without relying purely on results-based outcomes?
Outside of results, then, firstly, a coach, as I did say earlier, that I was able to work out, excuse me, I was able to work out my philosophies, principles, values. So, therefore, as a coach, what are they, and then how do you play them out? So they need to be on show, they need to be demonstrated, there needs to be tangible evidence that they're being delivered on a daily basis. So if I was to evaluate a coach, then the starting point for me is always about, well, you tell me what's important to you, you tell me what you believe in, and then you tell me how you deliver that, and what will I see. And so then if I was to be an evaluator or an observer of that coach, I should be able to see and measure what that person's doing on a daily basis. That aligns with their philosophy, values and principles. As I say, then on top of that, it's just results that sits outside that.
Now, I've seen you mention before that one of the healthy things in the Australian cricket team was the difference that existed between everybody. How do you go about leveraging the differences of players in a team setting to be an overall benefit?
That conflict can be both helpful, can be constructive, it can help change, and conversely, it can do the reverse. It can pull teams apart, it can really fragment group, create little cliques, very much work against a high performance culture, and people play for themselves as opposed to playing for the team. point fingers everywhere else apart from themselves. So in a sense, the coach's role is one to enhance the first part, and two to try to manage that second part, so that the pluses are always overriding a lot of the negative things that are always occurring with our group, because the group is large, it's like a big family, and there's always going to be differences of opinion. Provided we can surface a lot of those differences, a lot of the conflict, then we can deal with that. And in most cases, I was reasonably successful with that. Certain times, the 2005 Ashes Tour was a classic where I just didn't deal with that very well at all. And I see that as one of my, low points in my coaching career. Not necessarily the result, although we got beaten by the Ponds, so that threatened my career. So that wasn't nice, but it was more that I didn't deliver on sort of those philosophy, values, principles, and I don't know whether that would have changed the course of history, but I certainly would have felt that I'm giving it a far better shot than what I had done through that tour.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. Australians can tolerate a lot of things, but they can't really tolerate losing to England, which, yeah, it is what it is. But I've heard you mention before previously again that coaches can have a bit of a shelf life. Why do you think that is, and is there any way to combat that?
Well, if you ask that question to Wayne Bennett, Mick Malthouse, some of the other coaches in all range of sports that seem to just go on, and good luck to them for doing that, they would say that bloke's talking rubbish, And in fact, Wayne Bennett said that to me when I was coaching Queensland, because I did pose that question to him when I was coaching Queensland, because I've been there sort of 4 years by that stage. And I just said to him, I think it's time that I move on, because I do believe that there is a shelf life, meaning that in my own mind, going back into my own philosophy, values, principles again, in my own mind, I don't believe that I can assist the players anymore. I don't believe I can challenge them anymore. I don't believe that I can help them grow sufficiently. I think there will be others that can do much more than I. So that's why I believe that there is a shelf life. And he said, look, you're kidding. He said at the Broncos here, and so this is late 90s now, at the Broncos, and he would have been there about 10 years by that stage, 9 or 10 years. He said, there's two things that can happen here. Either I leave or the players leave, and I'm not going. His method there was, obviously, you keep certain key people around that are really aligned with your thinking, your philosophy, values, principles, those sorts of things, but are in the playing group. And so they're delivering on that in their own way. But then there are a lot of other people around that, in the sense either don't fit that or just don't have really the skill sets that you're looking for to deliver on the type of game that you want to play. So he was able then to, as I said, keep nucleus and move other players on. So he was really the centrepiece of that Broncos culture.
Yeah, it's probably pretty good that you bring up coaching different sports, because do you think that the principles of coaching and how you apply them differ when working with bigger squads and teams?
Potentially, but really I don't think so. To some degree, yes, a cricket squad, at least a touring cricket squad, say 15 or so, and these days, with COVID, you've got 20 plus players, and then you've got another 20 plus support staff. And so you've got a couple of massive teams that you've got to deal with, and then within those teams, there are teams within those teams. So these days, it's a pretty similar sort of job, I think, in terms of numbers. But ultimately, I don't think really the numbers matter so much, provided that you're in a position to make sure that messaging, communication is clear to everybody. And so whether it's a small group or not, if I'm not clear on my communications to a small group, then some people are hearing one thing, another one or two in that small group are hearing something else. And unless you can ensure that your communication is far clearer so that everybody's on the same page, then there'll be a problem at some point. And it won't necessarily always emerge immediately if you're in a so-called winning dressing room. Things are going along pretty well on the field. That poor communication or that miscommunication or that misinterpreted communication won't necessarily be as big an issue as if it was a losing dressing room. Everything's a problem. Everything's negative. Everything's wrong. So much to fix. Where do we start? All those sort of things. So as you increase the numbers, then it's still the same principle. You've just got to find a way then to make sure that that's communicated and consistently communicated and well communicated. And that may mean that you're breaking it down into smaller groups, and it may mean that you're giving responsibility to extra people in there to ensure that that's occurring. And that's why we do have some support stuff. That's why certainly a lot of football teams use this senior leadership group to help deliver on that process. So there are various ways and means of doing that effectively. So I don't think it is about numbers. I just think it's about, again, that process that you put in place to make sure that those communications are happening and that you've got good feedback loops to find out whether or not they're not, so that you can move quickly to prevent that becoming more of an issue than really what it could be. Should be.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense around having clear and concise communication to get everyone on board and on the same level. To divert a little bit though, if someone was elected Australian cricket coach today, what advice would you give them as to what not to do? What should they avoid as a coach or a leader?
I've just been caught up with Justin Langer, who's the current Australian cricket coach. We generally have a bit of a chat every month or so, and not necessarily instigated by Justin. I'm just looking from a distance and having experienced what he goes through, albeit that his coaching existence these days is far more complicated, I think, than what mine was. And I think generally due to, as we just said, size of groups, probably more so social media. That's a major issue. The conversation we had was still about you've got to be yourself. You've got to understand yourself, which is said at the outset, your philosophy, values and principles, and you've got to deliver on those. You've just constantly got to deliver on those. So, from a player's point of view or a support staff person in that mix, they may not agree with you all the time, and, one or two may not agree with you any of the time, but what becomes pretty certain is they know what you stand for. They understand who you are. So I think in terms of any coach, the biggest thing or the biggest mistake you can make is not to be yourself and to deliver yourself consistently and constantly. The coach begins to compromise on that in any way, shape or form to either suit certain situations, to suit certain individuals, or to appease certain shareholders or stakeholders that have an interest in the team or could have an impact on the team. Then I think it's fraught with danger. Because going back to this notion of respect, which embodies trust and honesty and sincerity, all those things kind of overlap. If the coach is changing, in other words, the person I get today is going to be different to the person I get tomorrow, then that makes individuals in that mix very wary of who this person is, what their agenda is, and what can I do and say today that I might not have been able to say yesterday. So that would be always, I think, the strongest piece of advice for a coach. And that may mean, of course, and it's happened to me a couple of times, that may mean that it does bring you into direct conflict with key players and key people within that group. And obviously in the cricket team, your most key person is the captain. And if the coach and the captain are not aligned, then generally it's a pretty short walking distance to the exit door for the coach.
Yeah, that's true. I can imagine when, dealing with small teams such as a cricket team, if people start coming in direct conflict, it can get pretty testy. Moving on to what you're doing now, which is Buchanan Success Coaching, what do you think are some of the biggest differences between sort of the more sport side and corporate? Like, what could the corporate world learn from what they do in sport?
The biggest difference I think I've found is one, that there's a lot of corporate speak around, yes, with high performance, or I'm a coach and a leader who listens and enjoys feedback, and I'm developing empowering my staff and giving them great opportunity to develop and grow. All the words are there, And the actions are there at certain times, but they're not there consistently. So to go back to what I was just saying before, I think that's one of the generalised failings of leadership in the corporate world, is that they will do things conditionally. So they become almost a conditional team player, certainly a conditional team leader. So if things are going well, yes, there's all those things that want to happen. If things are not going well and the numbers are not stacking up, they're not getting the results, and they're under pressure from their board, they're under pressure from a whole range of shareholders and stakeholders, and they're going to drive numbers, and they're going to drive transactions, and all the high-performance cultural stuff goes out the window. I think one of the really interesting differences between sport and business is that sport, in fact, has a luxury that business doesn't afford itself. It can, but it doesn't afford itself that luxury, and that is weekends not far away. So the sporting individual or the sporting team is in the preparation phase of getting ready for that competition or that event. And so, from a coach's perspective, we've got the game plan, and within the game plan, this is kind of the role, and these are the skills you need, and this is what we need you to do. And, we piece all that together so that by game day, the individual and or the team are in best position to play their best game, all right, before the whistle blows. Nobody knows who's going to win, generally. And then, of course, they go through the game, and so, lots of things happen in the course of a game, but at the end of the game, there's a result. And that result then leads to the process starting again. So that process is about reviewing what's happened, again, individually and collectively, what we set out to achieve, what did we achieve, what didn't we achieve, and now we've got a new event coming up. So what do we take from that to help us prepare for the next event? So that's a real luxury that business, in a sense, could do, but generally doesn't do. So, in other words, the leader, staff person comes to work, they get into their working day and finish the day, and then in the main, go home. Thank God a lot of times, but, could have been a great day. But very few then go through that process of saying, well, that was potentially an event. It was a work day, started, it finished. I set out to do certain things, or as a group, we set out to do certain things. How well did we go? What did we learn? What do we need to change so that we put ourselves in the best position for the next event, which is tomorrow? Very few corporates really do that, because an event in their minds is, it's weeks, it's months, it's years sometimes. It's just the end of year financials, getting those numbers, watching that. If they watch the share market, if they're a listed company, then in a sense, they could look at their share price as a means of one indicator of a result for that particular day or that particular week. So what businesses fail to do most of the times is set themselves up for success. So in other words, right, start of the day, here's my team, this is the day coming up, these are the sorts of things that are going to occur through the day, these are my expectations of outcomes, what does the team think? Spend 10 minutes on that. And then at the end of the day, either we reflect on that again, but probably not. But what we do the next morning is reflect on that. So spend 5 minutes on the reflection part, quick analysis of what we achieved, what we didn't achieve, and then 5 minutes on setting up the day for success again. So, the process is the same. It's just that it has to be shortened, because business is in competition every day. Sport happens to be in competition generally, every week, so, or every few days. They don't have to back up day after day after day after day, week after week. And so, again, this is reflected in the way that corporates then go about assessing themselves. So we were just asking before about how would you assess a coach? Well, for me, if I was assessing the CEOs and leaders, it'd be the same thing. So what are the key drivers for you? What are your key principles and values? Righto, so let's start the day and watch how you do that. And more often than not, generally the higher up the chain you go, all they do is run back-to-back meetings. So they spend little time actually preparing for a meeting, albeit that they're pretty intelligent people, so they retain a heck of a lot up in their head. Then they have the meeting. They then don't spend any time reviewing that meeting because they're just backed up. And generally, they're running late for the next meeting, so they spent very little time reviewing what had just occurred, both from an outcomes perspective, but also their impact, and then very little or no time setting up for the next meeting. And that sort of goes from, the whole day and then day to day, week to week. So I think business leaders would definitely factor in a heck of a lot more time on a reflective process, which indeed sport does very, very effectively. Effectively in terms of the process, whether it's effective in terms of results or something, another matter.
Yeah, that's a good and interesting point you brought up about how preparation in the sporting world is fairly prominent, yet in the corporate side of things, it can be pretty infrequent, if not non-existent. But to go about what you spoke about earlier in the conversation about how goals should be almost impossible, yet potentially achievable, you've mentioned something similar in your book about the concept of Everest, in that everyone should have their own Everest goal, that same sort of thing. It's almost impossible, yet potentially achievable. What is your Everest now?
Well, my Everest was, I suppose, when I went into this business, wanting to be somewhere globally, maybe in the top 50. So if any business or individual CEO, leader, no matter what, wanted to know something about coaching or leadership, then they'd press a button, here comes the top 50, and I sit in the top 50. So that would be my Everest. Now, I'm well short of that. These days, I think it just takes a huge amount of energy and time to do that, and I don't realistically have to understand it. I haven't got the time for that energy. The other thing I reckon has been pretty interesting with COVID that I've found in my business, initially it was good because it just meant going back to this notion of people running late, having to wait. If you're on a Zoom meeting, there's a time fixed and everybody's there, so that was good. But the Zoom meetings or the team meetings or however you interact virtually is just that, it's virtual. So there are so many nuances, relationship or parts of relationships or the fabric of relationships that are either no longer there or you can't see. And in essence, that's where really good coaching fits in. But what I have found now is that I think people are so used to using the screen in front of them that in my area of coaching leadership, if somebody's looking, they can look at 1,000 in 10 minutes. So it's become a very, very, very cluttered world out there in my space, and I'm sure it's the same in so many others in so many other consulting areas as well. But obviously some have really benefited from that, and it's the world's about timing and opportunity, I think, so sometimes the timing's there, but your opportunities are vice versa. The opportunity's there, but it's not the right time. But if the two come together, then you can do very well no matter who you are and what you do.
If you enjoyed this podcast episode, be sure to check out the website compoundingpodcast.com. On the website, you'll find every episode complete with transcripts, show notes, and other related resources. Either way, links to all content mentioned will be in the description below. Also be sure to sign up for my weekly newsletter, curated by Kalani, where I share what I've been reading, learning, and watching for that week. Same as the podcast, it's compressed to impress, and I aim for maximal return on your time invested. Sign up at kalanis.substack.com. So that's KALANIS.substack.com. You can also connect with me on Twitter at ScarrettKalani. But until next time, have a good one.